I consent to my interviews being on YouTube. And I speak fearlessly because one has to do that, So
Yes.
yeah.
So we'll start, talking
Is he
about.
ready to roll?
Rolling.
Okay.
So we'll start discussing about your the works that we have considering of. And told you have published almost 70 works. So few of the works that we are aware of are history of history, then Emperor of knowledge, then of Guinness, Gandhi and cricket, then the history of knowledge, and other work on Ashrafi.
Yes.
So these are the few works that we have read and we are very aware of. So we'll begin with history of history first. History of history, it's on nationalism.
Oops. I thought it was upside down. 1 minute. Okay.
We'll begin the discussion on history of history, one of your major works, which also about the scholarship of history. So, what would you say about the kind of research on modern history, the reflection on the modern research on modern history, modern Indian history that's being taking place in academic departments now? Because the issue is that now there is a lot of controversy regarding the rewriting of history.
Yes.
There is a conflict between a section of historians, who are just writing historian whatever, who hold the power in the sense that they are appointed to key institutions, so they can certainly dictate terms in that sense. And on the other side, you have historians who owe their allegiance to mass historiography or left history. So there is already one, and there are other historians who are not part of this the Marxist stream of writing. So how do you assess them in the kind of way the history is being rewritten? The issues also connected with the renaming of places.
Yes.
Renaming of places.
All right. So there are quite a few different dimensions because what you posed is really a series of related and connected questions. Let me begin with a different set of observations related to this, because I think that will help illustrate the nature of the problems that we are trying to talk about. I think the first thing that interests me and that I think is really pertinent to the discussion here is the question of how did we become so enamored of history in India? Now, yesterday I received a little YouTube video from a friend of mine, and this YouTube video is of an Indian scientist who yesterday or day before spoke at the National Academy of Sciences is having its annual meeting, and this person is a stem cell scientist and biologist, and he says in utter seriousness, he says that, look, I want to ask the audience, and remember he's addressing the country's most distinguished scientists because this is the National Academy of Sciences. And he says, I want to ask my audience, how can you explain that, how can you explain Gandhari having 100 children, the call-ups, because he says it's humanly impossible for a woman to give birth to 100 children. But he says, on the other hand, many people say it's myth. I don't think it was myth. I think this is history. And he says that this shows that we had stem cell research in India 4,000 years ago. All right. Now, the three of us sitting here and other people who would have some sense of, some idea, some notion of common sense and some notion of learning are going to find this astoundingly bizarre and stupid. But at the heart of this is the question, how did he even begin to think that the Mahabharata is history? Why should we begin to think that way? Were we ever bothered with thinking that it was? Now, I do know, of course, like most of us do, that the word that is used for the Mahabharata is itihas. But that doesn't make it history, nor was the author intending to, because itihas as a genre has to be understood quite differently than its modern translation. So, because if it's itihas, it's not kavya. Right? So you have to read that term relationally to other terms. And this notion that we have to now start thinking of the Mahabharata as history, as Ramayana as history, because of course the whole dispute over the Babri Masjid would not have been possible except in a context where we wanted to historicize everything. We wanted to historicize the Ramayana, we wanted to historicize the city of Ayodhya, we wanted to historicize Ram as a personality. Right? So, I'm suggesting to you that the heart of this, before we get into the present disputes, what are they disputing about, is the question of how we became so enamored of history. That question goes back to the colonial period. And I think it is, I won't dwell on it at length obviously now, since it's something I've done not only in the history of history, but in a stream of subsequent articles where some of the arguments were elaborated upon. But there was certainly in Europe by the 17th century what we might call a taste for history, a fondness for history. And if you look at European thought, we know that a distinction was made between a writer such as Herodotus on the one hand and Thucydides on the other hand. So I'm taking the two great figures from the Greek past who wrote something that today seems to resemble history. But the European view always was that Herodotus was shrouded in myth. So it was although his work, by the way, is called The Histories, And then Thucydides is viewed as the first proper historian of the Western world. His book, History of the Peloponnesian War, because of course there were certain criteria that became established by what counts as history or not. So if a work introduces a certain notion of a coherent chronology, for example, and I'm not saying I'm wedded to that idea, but some notion of a coherent chronology, some notion of causality, some notion of cause and effect, for example, right? Some notion of empirical evidence, so forth and so on. There were various criteria that began to be established, although that didn't really happen in the 17th century, that happened in more like the late 18th century, early 19th century. And then this kind of what we would today call positivist history became associated with people like Ranke. Now, to cut a long story short, for 19th century Indians, there was one fundamental question, I would argue, that every thinking Indian was asking himself or herself. And that question was, how did we as a people become colonized? I think every Indian, even the ones who were sympathetic to British rule, even the ones who today might be seen as loyal to British rule, they nevertheless still ask that question. And one of the people who asked that question, and a lot has been written about him, I refer to him in my book as well, is Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, the Bengali novelist, but he also wrote the historical novels, and he also wrote a whole series of essays. And Bankim, in one of his essays, makes a very interesting observation. He says that, the Englishman goes out on a hunt, and while he's on the hunt, he sneezes. And he takes a handkerchief out of his pocket, and he blows his nose, and then he puts a handkerchief back into his trouser pockets, and then he writes about it. And he says, such a trivial incident. And yet the Englishman thinks it worthy to record it. We, on the other hand, had great empires, majestic figures, and we let it all fall into rubble. Right? Look at the contrast. There the Englishman, so egotistic that he sneezes and he thinks it's a matter of that should be recorded for posterity. Right? So he sets up this contrast. And then in this book, Krishna Charitro, the life of Krishna, he makes a fundamental argument. He says that really, look, there are two kinds of Krishnas in the Indian tradition. There is the Krishna of the Bhagavad Gita, and then there is a Krishna of the Bhakti poets. The Krishna of Mirabai and the Krishna of Surdas, as opposed to the Krishna of the Bhagavad Gita. He says the problem in India is that we let ourselves be seduced by the Krishna of Surdas and Mirabai and the Bhakti poets. And what kind of absurd God is this? Absurd God. He could get away with it today. At that time, today if he said absurd God, he might be lynched by someone. But at that point, in that context, he could say that. And why does he ask this question, what kind of absurd God? Because he says, look, what are some of the most famous incidents in the life of Krishna? Let's take one illustration. The incident which is called Vastra Haran, the theft of the clothes. So here Krishna is in Mathura, there's a beautiful river Yamuna, he's walking by and he sees the gopis and they're taking a bath in the river. But he's a mischievous God. So what does he do? While they're taking a bath, he comes there and slowly, surreptitiously, he steals their clothes. Then he goes and hides on the top of a tree. And then when they're about to come out, he whistles to them, they find that their clothes are nowhere there. And then he says, if you want your clothes, come out and get them. Right? And so, he says it's not that he's morally outraged. That's important to understand. He's not morally outraged by this. He's outraged by the fact, what kind of God is this? This is an absurd God. I mean, stealing butter, makhan chor, stealing clothes. A God is supposed to be a model. A God is supposed to be someone like Muhammad, the Prophet, or the Buddha. And we have all these gods who are running around, making love to 1,000 women, stealing butter. Right? And then he says, yes, but actually we do have a historical Krishna. And the tragedy of India is that this Krishna was obliterated from the Indian consciousness. So what has he done? He has accepted the argument. Let's state it very candidly. He's accepted the argument that to be considered irrational people, and more importantly, to be considered as people who are the proper subjects of a proper nation state, you have to have a sense of history. The reason why we cannot be constituted into a proper nation state, Bankim is saying in the late 19th century when he's writing this essay, is because we are a people who are bereft, of a sense of history. We don't have one. And so now our project will have to be to instill this sense of history in everyone. Now that really is the background. And I would suggest to you that the VHP, I take the VHP rather than the BJP or RSS because the VHP does more of what you might call the cultural intellectual work. Right? That the VHP and its supporters in whatever shape or form are solidly committed to this idea that we have to instill a certain sense of history. So before we get into the question of what is, quote, right history or not, we first have to get a sense of why this became important and why, if the VHP and the Indian middle class as a whole is committed to this, why it suggests that the profound form of colonization that took place still persists completely today. Right? Because our investment in this question suggests that this colonization was not simply profound at that time, but continues to be so today.
The sense of history that we have,
yes,
what we understand as history,
yes,
is a product of the colonial paradigms, or one that instilled in the minds of Indians.
yes.
So we don't have other forms of history or historical.
Yeah, all right. So now then we get to the second part of and subsequent, the questions that you had raised before, because I think that when one makes an argument, that the Indian style of reasoning, one should do the Purva Paksh, one should anticipate the objections to the argument that one is making. And in a sense, the question that you have now posed, it moves us in that direction. But before I get to that, let me establish one more thing which I've already mentioned now, but I want to state it very clearly, and then I want to address a number of linked questions that you've asked. And that is that the project, that the idea of history as we know it today has a firm relationship to the idea of the nation state. I think that that is really quite critical for us to understand. I can say with absolute confidence that if you look at the history of decolonization movements around the world in the 20th century, the first thing that every nation state does when it emerges, when the people become free, is the state creates, it funds an official history of the nation. It happened in India, it happened in Indonesia, it happened in Pakistan. You know, there is, by the way, an official history of the freedom movement in Pakistan. And when you read that, you'll be astonished to find that Mohandas Gandhi barely appears. Now, you have to think to yourself, I mean, how was that possible? He should appear at least as a Rakshas, you know, from that point of view, or as a demon or whatever, or as misinformed Hindu. But he barely even appears. How do you actually write something called the history of the freedom movement in Pakistan without even mentioning? Right? But the fact that they had to create that history, this is an official project of the state. We had that project too in India. We had several of these kinds of official projects because that official project of creating a history is in fact the first step towards saying that we are now a fulfilled people, or this is the legitimate record of who we are. Right? And every nation state has done that. Right? So I think that that's a critical part of the story that we have to look at here. And this also means, therefore, now that the kind of disputes you were alluding to, which I'll just come to in just a moment, are not unique to India. There have been what are called history wars in several countries. I would say in every country, but some are much better reported than they are in other cases. You know. So, for example, the history wars between Japan and China over the Great Asia-Pacific War, or what is called World War II, but in Japan they call it the Great Asia-Pacific War. And what was the extent of Japanese atrocities? So there are different accounts from the Chinese side and from obviously the Japanese side. Now we know the accounts have always been there, but they filter now into history textbooks. So there are these disputes over the contents of history textbooks.
Please carry.
Yeah. So now there are two questions that now remain. So the first is this whole question of what are the disputes about today? And the second is, can we think of history in multiple registers? You know, that's not the phrase you use, but that's what you mean to say. Let me begin with the second one, because the two really are connected to each other. I know that the first major rejoinder to what I've said, and it is a serious objection in some ways, and it's the most obvious objection, is that, all right, let's just say if I have a critique of the idea of history, does this mean that I want to do away with it altogether? And a particularly peculiar argument someone might say, given that I am a professor of history. My response to this is the following, that there are some people who have argued that the sense of history is now like a fait accompli. That is that whether we like it or not, we are now all used to the historical movement. And in fact, I think that there is some merit in that observation. If there is some merit in that observation, then that would show that the nature of the problem is even more profound than one might have thought. Because the worst thing you can tell a small tribe, that you can tell an Amazonian tribe or an American Indian group, the worst thing you can tell them is you don't have a sense of history. For example, in the US where I've taught for 25 years, every single group They want their history recorded by their own people. This is also a fallacy, incidentally, the supposition that one's own people will necessarily produce the best history. I mean, that's what Edward Said in Orientalism in the last pages refer to second order Orientalism. Now we don't need the white man to write our history. The Hindutva chaps are doing it for us, and they are doing a much worse job than any other colonizers ever did. Right? So we should immediately get rid of that fallacy, the supposition that if we write it, it will necessarily be better. This is not an invitation for the white man to come back and write a history, of course not. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I'm just saying that we should be wary of this idea, right? So, but going back to that, I was saying that, to that example I was giving, that if you look at, let's say, as I said, any group, the American university system is really today predicated on the idea of identity politics. Okay? Identity politics is at the core of it. And the history of this goes back to the 1960s, but it wasn't as juvenile then as it is today. Because back then there was a purpose, there was an intent, there was a politics to it. Now it's just the default position. So if you're a Indian American, transgendered person, then you have to belong to a group that is Indian American transgender. Everyone has their group, everyone has their history, and this becomes part of the official record. Right? So what I'm saying is that this idea that we all should be represented by a certain form of writing has now, I think, taken over the whole world. I suspect there isn't a group that isn't in some ways complicit with that notion. All right? And this is what I mean when I say that to some extent it is a kind of a fait accompli. But you can read it in a different way too, because you could say that, look, to have a sense of history is something like having a sense of citizenship. Okay? It's to be equipped with certain things that you need. But the question really here is, what is history then? It's a way of looking at the past. That would be the simplest argument. Of course, if you wanted to complicate a little bit more, you could say it's really a way of constructing the present, because when we look at the past, it's always from the vantage point of the present, and it has something to do with how we construct our sense of the present. But the question also has to do with whether there are different modes of apprehending the past. Now, clearly, I think that was the case in India. Because, after all, if you look at the Babri Masjid, right, let's take that, because many of the disputes, and I think this issue will come back, the Supreme Court is going to be listening in on the petition in the next few days, correct?
Yeah.
And it's going to continue. We know that the whole idea of the Ram Mandir building that is there on the agenda. And it's not very interesting to consider why they haven't done anything about it, because we can always get into modern day politics and political expediency and all of that. That's less interesting, I think, right? But let's just, if we go back to the Babri Masjid issue, all right? This also gives us a segue into these questions in a different way. So when the masjid was brought down, the first question that occurred to me was, the masjid had been standing there for 400 some years, 400, 450 years. Why did we get so excited about it now? Now, I do know, of course, that shortly after independence, there was an episode. Shortly after independence, there was a little episode there. But it didn't lead to, it was diffused very quickly in comparison to what happened obviously beginning in the late 1980s and then eventually leading to the destruction of the mosque on 6th December 1992. So why were Hindus agitated? Whoever Hindus might be, because that also is a bit of a, for a scholar of what's called religion, whatever that might be, that itself is an issue, right? What do we mean when we speak of Hindus? Because we know that in 1700, people would have characterized themselves as Vaishnavas or Shaktos or Tantrics whatever the case may be, right? Not as Hindus, really. But let's leave that aside for a moment. So why did this issue become suddenly so prominent? And of course, one of the reasons it became prominent is because we had now been seduced into thinking that the only kind of narrative that has legitimacy is something that we call history. And that this history is written in a certain kind of mode. Now when the Ramjanmasthan incident occurred, the destruction of the mosque, and so I have a chapter on that in my history of history as well, what was most striking to me from the scholarly standpoint was the extent to which all those who disagreed with each other on various points, such as whether there ever was a temple there or not, that would be an illustration, or whether the Muslims had a monopoly on this kind of thing, that is on the destruction of, because I heard many people on the left, including some friends of mine, saying that, well, Hindus had destroyed Jain temples before, this is what is called spoliage. So there were these kinds of arguments. But what struck me was the unanimity of opinion that the only way to think about this was to think through the historical mode, and whoever could establish a better historical narrative had therefore the better hand. And I think the most interesting intervention in this dispute was by the late Ramu Gandhi, who wrote a book, Sita's Kitchen, where he looks at this, and then he looks at the whole history of this area. He looks and he imagines, as it were, certain kinds of conversations. He points to the fact that this complex had another building called Sita Ki Rasoi. That's why the book is called Sita's Kitchen, right? So, and he suggests that this was, in a way, a kind of a kitchen which fed people of different sensibilities and different faiths, right? What is he trying to do? What he's trying to do is he's trying to suggest we're not going to be able to resolve this through the historical modality, right? That there's but it's not simply an admission of the weakness of the historical modality in resolving it. He's suggesting that we have to think civilizationally. And history is a mode of the nation state, it's not a mode of the civilizational type. That is really what he was trying to suggest. So this is the way in which I would frame many of the questions that are taking place. We can get to much more particularities about history, textbook controversies. Some of that has to do with modern day politics, who's in power. When people come into power, they'll have it rewritten. But that's relatively
related to this.